There have been some really controversial things that have happened throughout our recent history involving firearms, and that's what I'm going to talk about today as I give you the 7 most controversial guns that have ever existed. Now, if you're a gun owner in the United States, this is probably no secret to you that certain guns are held at a higher standard because of things that they have been involved with. But at the same time, one thing you have to understand in my position here is I look at these as inanimate objects, just like any other tool or weapon out there. And the only time they can do harm is with input from a user that wants to do the harm. So this video is in no way to demonize any of these guns whatsoever, more so to bring light to some of these events that have happened and the ramifications for gun owners afterwards. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about the history of each gun that I'm going to bring up here as well, but mainly I really want to focus on those events and how gun owners kind of had to pay for the sins of very few. And that is something that I hope that you will take away from this video is, how there are so many guns in the United States, so many gun owners, and yet the few and far between that are bad apples will sometimes paint and pave the way for restrictions for law-abiding gun owners. But of course, whether you agree or disagree, I want to hear your opinion after the video. And if you like what I do, consider subscribing, hit your notifications so you never miss a video from me. And if you want to join the SHOT team, you can do that right here on YouTube or over on Patreon and gain access to some pretty cool perks. Let's go and get into it. Now, the first event that I want to talk about was actually the JFK assassination. This had big ramifications for gun owners everywhere. JFK was actually in Dallas at the time, and he was trying to smooth over some friction that was happening in the Democratic Party, specifically between Governor Conley and Senator Yarborough, both Democrats in the state of Texas. So he wanted to show unity in the party in order to, get the votes of Texans and, quite frankly, people throughout the United States. And so what they did is they had a 2-day, 5-city event in which they would all be, kind of partying together. Not really partying, but, they would party up and, they would do speeches and all this kind of stuff together. And they were met with a fairly warm welcome. But Lee Harvey Oswald had other plans. Now, doing some research on Lee Harvey Oswald, he was a Marine, and so his whole family had ties to the Marine Corps, okay? But one interesting fact that I found out about his father, who was Robert Lee Oswald Sr., is he was actually a distant cousin of the Confederate General Robert E. Lee and a third cousin to Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald was pretty much a problem child, and then once he joined the Marine Corps, he was actually court-martialed a couple of times, actually a few times. He got into trouble, and then eventually he did leave the Marine Corps, but he left on a fairly good note because of sickness with his mom, so he had to tend to her. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald was actually known to kind of sympathize with the communists. He taught himself Russian. He actually moved to Russia for a period of time, married a Russian woman, had a kid over there, and eventually came back to Dallas. One interesting thing is that I found with his time in the Marine Corps is not only did he get in trouble quite often, but he also had a nickname from his Marines that served with him, which was Oswald Scovich. Oswald Scovich, I believe, is what it was, because he was always, kind of spouting off communist ideas. And it's really no surprise considering what was going on at this time. The end of World War II, that's when the Cold War essentially started, and the United States was and Great Britain was specifically worried about communism taking over the entirety of Europe, with France, Greece, and Italy specifically, right? So the Cuban Missile Crisis was another part of this, right? And then very shortly after, JFK was assassinated, actually before he was assassinated, well, actually, even when Eisenhower was still president, I think he sent 700 troops to South Vietnam, and then JFK sent another, I don't know, 12, 16,000, 12 to 16,000, somewhere in there. So of course that's right before, our involvement, or right when our involvement started in Vietnam. The Chinese Civil War at this time, going on. And of course, in response to NATO being created and the United States joining NATO, the Warsaw Pact was created on the Soviet and communism side. So I say all that because Lee Harvey Oswald was a staunch defender of communism and against freedom, democracy, liberty, and of course representative republic, which is what we are. And JFK, of course, was completely against communism and the ideals of that. So all that to say, November 22nd, 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald sat in the depository building in Texas from the 6th floor, and he shot 3 times. And of course, the gun he used, which was an Italian Carcano, was a mail order gun. So at the time, you could actually, order these guns. And actually, he used an alias to order that gun and a Smith & Wesson .38 revolver. So essentially, you put in your order, you pay a little bit of shipping, and boom, the gun is shipped right to you. Now, I've talked about the background checks and how most background checks and the background check system that we use today is super flawed. And at the same time, if you don't have background checks and FFLs, people can look at situations just like this, where the guy was able to order, a gun and have it shipped directly to his home. So I do understand both sides of that, but considering how flawed the background check system is in the United States and how many errors people actually either make in that system, or the lack of states putting in information, or the lack of funds to pay people to do that, really is the downfall of the entire background check system. So when they talk about improving background check systems, what they mean is they want to expand that to every gun sale ever, right? Because they want to know who has what gun, and they want to be able to track all of them down, which is against American ideals. It's against what our country was founded upon. Totally different video. So there is controversy there for sure, and it led to ramifications for gun owners. So, the Gun Control Act did affect Americans in a pretty big way. One guy, and of course him killing the President of the United States and being such a high profile case, and plus he killed a police officer too. Not a lot of people know that, with that .38 Smith & Wesson revolver. J.D. Tippit was the police officer's name. And of course, Lee Harvey Oswald was unalived soon after that on live TV. Now the next gun I want to talk about is not the Strybog SP10A3, but I actually have a review coming very soon on this gun, so stay tuned. But the one I do want to talk about is the Thompson submachine gun. Now, I love doing these videos because I always find out new bits of information, and the Tommy gun or the Chicago typewriter or the trench broom or whatever other designation you want to call this gun, or a nickname you want to call this gun, I should say, has a really storied history. Now, Brigadier General John T. Thompson is actually the creator of this firearm. And so they were trying to basically kind of end the stalemates between this, long range, no man's land type of warfare that was going on in World War I. And 2 days before prototypes of the first Thompson submachine gun could be sent over to Europe, the war ended. So in the early 20s, they were actually sold to civilians. Now at this time, they were sold for $200, which is like $3,400 in today's money. I mean, they were always an expensive gun, but at a price of $200, that is a crazy amount of money. So needless to say, they didn't sell very well when they first came out. Now you'll see a number of different changes that actually happened with the gun, specifically the 1928 A1, which is what eventually came up into World War II, but we'll talk about that in a minute. I want to talk about the more notorious side that actually used these guns, which were gangs during Prohibition and the Depression era, and specifically the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which happened in 1929 on, you guessed it, Valentine's Day. Now, Bugs Moran was actually the target of this crime, but just so happens that one of his associates dressed pretty much just like him, and Bugs was running late that day. So when 4 guys showed up, 2 were dressed as police officers, and the other 2 held 7 men at gunpoint in this garage up against a wall, and then the 2 other guys with the Tommy guns actually unloaded on them. One of them had a 50-round drum, the other had a 20-round box magazine. Now, it's pretty wide known that Bugs Moran and his gang were actually hijacking liquor shipments and stuff off of Al Capone. So they had a beef constantly going back and forth, and Bugs Moran was stepping on Al Capone's territory. So that's why Al Capone was, one of the prime suspects, or by proxy, they thought Al Capone had hired somebody to put him up to this. So there was quite a few Al Capone related men that were suspected to be charged of this crime. And honestly, there was never enough evidence to really convict anybody. So there actually an incident in 1929, later in 1929, happened with Fred Burke. Now, Burke was actually a hired killer. He was a gunman. He actually at one point started working with Al Capone. And so, this guy was a seasoned criminal, and he got drunk one night. He rear-ended somebody, drove off, and a police officer started chasing him, jumped onto the vehicle that Burke was driving, and Burke ended up fatally wounding that police officer. They were able to catch up to Burke, and then they raided Burke's home after all this happened, and they found the 2 Thompson submachine guns along with like $320,000 worth of bonds that had recently been stolen. Now, one thing that did come out of all this was a fairly new concept at the time, but it was forensic ballistics. Dr. Calvin Goddard was actually like the pioneer in all this, and he was able to confirm that the 2 Tommy guns that were recovered at Burke's home were the same ones used in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And as a result, the 1934 NFA Act was signed by Franklin D. Roosevelt, which really restricted, machine guns of any kind, short barrel rifles, short barrel shotguns, and suppressors. Now, of course, the other side of it is the Thompson submachine gun that was used in World War II. Now, it wasn't just the Americans that used this gun. The British used it, the Chinese used it. They made their own copies, of course. Through land lease, the Australians used it. And it was a fairly pretty prized gun. Soldiers tended to really like it. They did not like the fact that it only held 20 rounds, so they would tape 2 20-round mags together, and eventually a 30-round mag was adopted. Now, the gun went through a number of different changes. The M1928A1 actually had a cooling fins on the barrel. It could accept the 50-round drum or the 20-round mag. It also cocked from the top, and it was a delayed blowback. And then they eventually simplified the gun. They eliminated the cooling fins. It could only take a 20-round box magazine. They simplified the rear sight, and they had it load with a side charging handle, and it was a straight blowback. So overall, the gun actually did end up serving a purpose, or a good purpose, in the hands of Americans and other countries that used it to protect American interests and the British and, the Allies' interests, I should say. And 1.5 million of them were created during World War II, which definitely outnumbered the grease gun, which was made to replace the Thompson submachine gun. But again, it came in later in the war, and so the Tommy gun still was the most produced SMG on the American side during World War II. The gun's been in the public hands for a long time. It was one of the guns that was at the center of the assault weapons ban. Done a video on that already too. Quite a few videos that I've explored here, or topics on guns that I've explored here. But regardless, this didn't become controversial until the Crandon shooting that happened in Wisconsin in 2007. Now, it was the weapon of choice in a number of high-profile shootings, but one thing you have to remember is that handguns are like 78% of the time are used in mass shootings, and nobody even knows how to define mass shootings. That's why you'll always see like these numbers that say, you know, these events are going up, and then others will say they've been stagnant. Others say these events have gone down over time. My belief is that because these things are so highly publicized, at least the ones that they kind of want to be publicized, right? It really depends, what it seems anyways, who the shooter is, what he looks like, and what kind of gun was used. If it doesn't fit one of those criteria, typically you won't hear about it as much or as long as others. So you probably get where I'm going with that. And so that's why a lot of gun owners, when they see these kinds of things, it just, you know, it's something we don't ever wish on anybody at all. But at the same time, we always have to look at these things with our guard up, because, you know, at the end of the day, we're going to be blamed. And at the end of the day, you know, rifles, all types of semi-auto rifles are used in less than 3% of total unalivings every single year. And I keep bringing that up for a reason, because, you know, there's so many of them out there, and yet they're used so little of the time. So it's, you know, it's so easy to kind of demonize something like this, and yet you look at this and you're like, oh, it's a handgun, it's a pistol. And yet these are used more, way more, exponentially more. As a matter of fact, you know, fists and knives are used more than this right here. So it's not the American gun owner that's the problem. It's how these events are publicized, and knowing that if they can get this, then they will most definitely come for this, because rifles will have basically zero net impact if you were to be able to take these away. First of all, if you were to be able to ban them, well, you still have, who knows, 20 million, 50 million of these in civilian hands. Then, if you were able to go door to door to door and gather all of these up, well, you still wouldn't make that big of an impact, because again, they're only used in less than 3%. And people would just take handguns and use those instead. Virginia Tech. You know, what about Columbine? You know, I hate to bring all these things up, and I'm not going to mention the shooters' names. I'm not going to show their faces. I'm not going to show any clips, because I think that's a big problem. It's a big part of the problem, especially since Columbine. You know, just documentaries and movies and all of this kind of stuff that is just honed in on these two killers that essentially, you know, have kind of gained an unfortunate cult following because of all the media portrayal of them, or all the media attention that they've gotten. So I'm not going to do that here, but those are examples. You know, actually they were failed bombings, to be honest with you. So people will use anything. I think that's the point I'm trying to get at here, is people will use anything to harm other people. In a free society, you will always have a certain percentage of that. But when you look at the actual facts of these that are used in crimes, super heinous, none of us want to see it, but statistically it is very low as far as these happening. So the outrage over this, in my opinion, is caused more by the media than there being an actual problem with this rifle. And then on the other side, we have the AK-47, of course. Now, it's interesting because Eugene Stoner and Mikhail Kalashnikov both served during World War II. While Eugene Stoner was an armorer, and so he mainly was in the Pacific and northern China, Mikhail Kalashnikov was actually a tank commander. Now, they had run into some small numbers of the Sturmgewehr, the STG-44, and he said the thoughts of that rifle kept him up at night, and so he wanted to create a gun that would counter that. Now, he initially actually lost out to the SKS, which I actually have right here behind me, and MIKAIL's first design to replace the PPS H-41 and the Mosin Nagants actually had a fixed magazine like the SKS, right? It used a design that was very similar to the M1 Garand. It lost out to the SKS, and then in 1946 they ran another trial in which the AK-47 was now more closely patterned after that STG-44, and it introduced a curved magazine, detachable magazine at that. So when you look at the STG-44 compared to the AK, I believe MIKAIL always kind of denied that the STG-44 was was some kind of a crazy inspiration, but I don't believe that. I think it absolutely was a huge inspiration because the guns look very, very similar. But regardless, he made a stamped and a milled version, and those ended up being adopted in 1949. Now, of course, changes were made with the manufacturing process. So you have the AKMs, you have, AK-74s, which actually use the 5.45x39, AK-103s. There's a whole variety of them. But at its core, AKs are known for being super reliable, and a lot of our soldiers found this out in Vietnam, where we were still carrying the M14, which is big, heavy, can't carry a lot of ammo with you, and you really can't shoot it in select fire because the 308 is just, it's too much of a round to be shooting in select fire fully auto. M16 went on to serve for a long time, replaced by the M4, replaced just recently by the SIG MCX Spear. The AK-47, on the other hand, kind of gained notoriety for sure from Vietnam, but also the fact that the Russians wanted these in every Warsaw Pact country alliance that they had. The Eastern Bloc, they gave the plans, of course, or the licensing rights to China, so they made the Type 56. Hell, they would give them to countries that weren't even fighting just so they could have them. They didn't care the reason. As long as you were with them, they would let you produce them, and they would send these things out pretty much everywhere. And still, to this day, it is the most widely used true assault rifle anywhere else in the world. And a number of different modern guns, like the CZ Bren 2 MS, utilize that same 7.62x39 round. So interesting how both of these guns gain notoriety in different ways at different times, but at the same time they both have been demonized greatly because, in large part, because of the way they look, right? Because one thing you have to keep in mind when you look at some of these rifles that we're talking about, and practically the vast majority of them, almost all of them, while they may look like a military weapon or a weapon of war, which is a phrase they like to throw around out there in the media, this is actually no different than the handguns I have right behind me. Meaning, the round's different, more velocity, all of that kind of stuff is true, of course. But one trigger pull, one bullet, semi-auto, that's the way these guns work. If you want full auto guns of any kind, you're going to have to go through a rigorous process, FFL, SOT, in order to do all of that. And so, yes, while they do look like they would come from the military, these are not military guns. And so I say all of that because when you look at an AR-15 or even an AK-47, no matter if it's one that was imported or one that actually was made right here in the US, they're all semi-auto rifles. Now let's get into modern times a little bit, and let's look at Canik. So they started in the early 90s, and they basically had copies of like the Walther P99, but outside of Turkey, nobody really knew who they were until they partnered with Century in 2009. That's when they started releasing their TP9 series. And so, one of the guns that they released was the TP9 SA. Now, these guns were actually a pretty great value. You know, with all Canics pretty much, you get the gun, you get a hard case, you get a holster, you know, you get an entire cleaning kit, you get tools to break down, you get multiple magazines. I mean, it really is an impressive kit that comes with pretty much all Canics, and they're at a really good price. But the SA had another feature on it that not a lot of people were into at the time, and that was the decocker that sat right on the top. Now, the decocker was really meant for breakdown, but the fear was that if you hit that decocker inadvertently, accidentally, whatever, that it would then render the trigger absolutely useless. And I know specifically Tactical Response and James Yeager actually did a number of different tests with that decocker, and they never inadvertently hit it. So it was kind of an issue that was just brought up, and maybe one that could have been valid, but at the end of the day, they actually ended up fixing that decocker situation. So the later models, the Mod 2s, they would actually fire in double action, and then subsequent shots would be single action. So it never really killed the trigger again after that SA version. But that was a gun that caused quite a bit of controversy in more modern times. Now, the next most controversial gun I want to talk about is the Derringer that was used by John Wilkes Booth to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. Now, of course, John Wilkes Booth was able to sneak into the president's box at Ford Theater while Lincoln and his wife were watching a play. He was able to get by security, and with one .44 caliber shot, he was able to kill the President of the United States, right? Well, he actually ended up dropping that gun, and it was picked up by a patron and turned over to investigators. Now, this was a gun made by Henry Derringer of Philadelphia, and so once the investigation was over, of course, John Wilkes Booth ended up getting shot and paralyzed inside of a barn because he was on the run. He was, moving from place to place, basically trying to get with Confederate sympathizers, and eventually, he was shot and paralyzed and died 3 hours later. Now, once they were done with the investigation, they actually turned the theater into a museum, and Ulysses S. Grant III actually wanted to have the gun on display in the museum. Well, it was originally thought that this was just going to intrigue people's morbid fascination basically with the gun, as opposed to being some historical artifact, but eventually it was put on display. Now, the second part of the controversy comes in 1997. So essentially, there was people that were tied to a number of different robberies, and they said that in the 60s, they actually replaced the Henry Derringer with a replica, and they had the original. Well, the FBI got involved, and the way they determined if this gun was real or not was actually pretty cool. Now, they didn't want to fire it, so of course, they couldn't really use ballistics, but they looked at a number of different pictures from the 30s. They looked at a number of different features that they could easily tell. One was a big crack in the forestock. This gun also had left-handed rifling, which was different for that type of gun at that time. And they used dental material to take an implant of the inside of the barrel and some of the components to be able to compare that, again, to the original. So that's how they were able to determine rifling and all of that kind of stuff. And, by them doing that, they were able to definitively say that that pistol is the original one that was used to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. And the last one is the good old Glock pistol. The one that people thought you were going to be able to sneak through airport security and was going to be a national security threat. And Gaston Glock basically did something that other companies weren't really doing at the time, and that is investing in high-grade polymers. Now, of course, HK actually had the first striker-fired polymer frame gun, but this was the first successful striker-fired polymer frame gun. And so, anti-gunners everywhere were like, oh my God, this plastic gun, it's going to be a criminal special. You're going to be able to get it through airport security. Not realizing that, the major parts of the gun are still metal. The slide, the barrel, the springs, the lower, the trigger assembly, all of that is metal. Now, I believe there was a Pentagon security officer that was trying to prove that you could get these through airport security. So he actually took them apart, and from what I read, he took one of the recoil spring and like disguised it in like a pair of glasses or something. But again, this was all prior to TSA, and TSA stops a lot of guns getting through airport security these days. And so all of that panic really didn't turn out to be anything. You know, it was just one of those things like, hey, this is something new, you know, it's made of plastic and we can easily demonize this thing, and the American public's going to get behind us because they're not informed about it yet, right? So it seems like people try to jump on things that, you know, are new, kind of suspicious. Maybe they look scary, maybe they don't look scary, but they're all, you know, made of plastic entirely, whatever. Try to get the public on your side, and once you get that public support from people that don't know any better, well, now you got a better chance of getting things passed. And so that's where you see quite a bit of the controversy coming from in some of these guns, and in other ones, they're just high profile cases. And so there we go, man. I really enjoy doing videos like this. And so if the response continues to be as good as it has been on some of these videos that I'm doing, I will continue to put them out there because I really love looking up not only the history of the gun, but some of the crazy events that happened with that gun and some of the after effects with gun owners as well. So if you like this type of content, do me a favor, please subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends, like the video, get us into the algorithm and let me know that you like it. That's the best way to do it. If you want to support what I do, of course, subscribing, and you could also become a member of the SHOT team and gain access to some pretty cool perks, either right here on YouTube or over on Patreon. Big thanks to you guys. See you in the next one, and as always, hold 'em down.